Next up, nearly 300 people are released from maximum security prison every year in Massachusetts, and many of them go straight from their cell to the street. Without any help from the state as they re-enter society, many of them will end up right back in prison. In fact, 40% of all maximum security prisoners are reincarcerated within 3 years of their release. It's a process that some prisoners and activists see as a recipe for failure.
The statistics speak for itself. Like, everybody goes back into all the trauma now that I'm going through. I feel like it's just, I know I got a lot to lose now. It's even more.
Jamal Vital was recently released after 2 years at Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center, the state's maximum security prison in Lancaster. He shared his story with GBH News Deputy Investigations Editor Jenifer McKim, who joins me now, along with Mac Hudson, a community liaison coordinator and reentry consultant for the Prisoners Legal Services of Massachusetts. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here.
Hi, Tori.
So Jamal Vital, can you just give a little overview of kind of his experience? You worked with him on this story, and you've worked with him for a while, and you've been advocating for him. Can you just talk a little bit about what he's experienced?
So Mac introduced me to Jamal, and because I wanted to do this story, that I'd heard that there was this large percentage of people who are being released directly from maximum security prison to the street without sort of the traditional step-down programs that you can have in a minimum or pre-release program, working outside, getting outside. Basically, he spent nearly 2.5 years in maximum security prison at the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center, like locked in his cell before he was released, sent out basically in chains, wearing his prison-issued shoes, and released to the street without sort of the things that would help him succeed when he was being released.
Yeah, and you've been focusing, too, as part of this series about reentry. You know, what happens to people when they are released and they have nothing and no kind of step down, right? Because I can imagine it's really jarring.
Yeah, so this is part of our ongoing series called Life After Prison, where we're looking at folks who are being released from prisons, all of the prisons in Massachusetts. And this particular statistic just really stuck out to me, that people were being released like that. And Matt can talk a lot more about it as a formerly incarcerated person, but anywhere you leave a prison, it's hard to have that transition, and there's not enough programming and not enough help for people who are being released. But people being released from maximum security, where most of them are in there for 20 hours a day in their cell, unable to really do things that will help them when they come out, just makes it a lot harder to succeed, to find work, to do things, when it affects your mind in lots of ways.
Yeah, Matt, can you talk about that? Just that, you know, you're going from being almost like this classification of civilian that is stripped of all your rights, and then upon release, you know, how do you look at the options ahead of you? What does that look like?
Well, the truth is, there really isn't. I don't think most people, when they get out, they're really thinking that far. They're just happy to get out in that moment and second. But then once they're out, the reality sinks in that now that they really have to now do what it takes to survive. And if you've been locked up in a cage for the majority of your time, well, what does survival look like for you? You know, and I think that that's what's missing. A lot of folks look at, or they have this great debate about the conditions of what the conditions should be, what it isn't be. Well, there's entitlements that every Massachusetts prisoner has. And that entitlement is to make sure that they have program access, reentry access, and a step-down process. And that's what fundamentally is being deprived here. Those step-down process in order to justify and rationalize bed space that otherwise would be empty in the maximum security I'm speaking, right? So when you're using the classification process in that manner, right, that deprives folks to go down in lower security, they could never make it down to a minimum or a pre-release.
Well, I want to stop you there, because that's a big part of the story that I think is worth stopping to kind of explain, is the classification process, right? So there is a system, and you spoke to state officials, prison officials, who've said, like, people will be eventually stepped down to lower security. That's where they're given these resources within this system, right? Or they're moved into a different part of Sousa. But that's not what happened to Jamal, and it sounds like it's not what happens to a lot of people. So what is that? How does that work, or not work, I guess, in this case?
Well, it doesn't work, period. That's the problem. So you have a lot of folks that are getting out in various different securities. And maximum security is a lot of folks getting out that are short-termers, but they've been up there 4 or 5 years under those types of conditions. Those conditions are abnormal, right? To be locked up 21, 22 hours in some cases, an hour a day in your cell, and not having no one to really converse with, and then you come out for those little small periods of time. Well, how does someone orientate to now the world is moving that fast, right? Where you have to now take responsibility in a way that you've been deprived responsibility while you've been there. So the whole point of the classification process is that as you step down, you gain greater autonomy of yourself. When you're in the maximum security, it's because you're saying, or they at least believe, that you have to be watched. When you're in the medium security, it's because now they're saying you can observe the rules.
And the classification is basically you're now classified as, less dangerous or whatever, and that's when you get those resources, but you're not given the same resources. And so that process, it isn't happening, though, for people. Is that legal?
So let me dispel one thing. Programs, services are supposed to be at every facility, whether you're in maximum, minimum, medium, it doesn't matter. They have an obligation to run those programs, but they don't run them in the maximum security prison, right? And then the ones that they choose to run do not help you deal with the onslaught of being subjected to that, what I call mind-numbing experience of being locked up and under those conditions. So you have folks who are developing mental health issues, or that are, if they already had it, it's being exacerbated, right? And if they didn't have it, now they're actually being exposed to having those issues. And these things go undiagnosed, right? Untreated. And now they're not even getting program services like education, whether there's GED access, what they're supposed to get is mandated, whether they're getting programs which deals with their drug addiction, they're not getting any access to any of those under the guise and under the name of security.
And Tori, what we found also by looking at the data was really like if you are black or brown, you're much more likely to be in the maximum security prison. And if you're a white prisoner, you're much more likely to be in a pre-release or a minimum. And what there has been reports coming out that are just talking about the racism, the structural racism in the correction system that they've already found within, the world in general. And so these numbers are pretty stunning.
Yeah, you talked about this report that's going on you talked about a couple of reports, one that came out that showed a connection between people's race, age, and their educational status in determining their classification, whether or not they would be able to go into a lower sentence or less
lower security prison.
Lower security prison. Thank you. And then there's a new one coming out with the Department of Corrections and UMass Chan School, I think, that you talked about.
They just announced that they're doing this. They're actually, in one hand, the DOC said this is evidence-based classification, and then in the other hand, they said we're cooperating with the study to look at it and see if we can improve the system. So there are definitely an acknowledgement that there are problems within the system.
Right. I mean, they're going to do a review. Do you have any idea when?
It just started.
Okay, it just started now.
Yep.
Okay. I wonder, there's so much evidence to support this, and this isn't legal, right? I mean, the state has denied that this is the case. They said, we have our classification protocol. It's for everyone's safety, right? But, through your work with Jamal, has it been frustrating? Do you feel like you're just banging your head against a wall?
Well, I feel like there's guys like myself that understands the process of coming out and what you need to do in order to kind of survive out here. But absent these spaces or individuals that are out here and folks that don't have that level of support at any sphere, they're basically forced to kind of figure that out, and that's what leads to the recidivism, because it's not easily designed for them to figure out where to access services at when they get out here. And then most of those services they're supposed to be getting just like an ID. They're supposed to get the major ID. Jamal just got out not even a month ago, and he didn't have an ID. Kevin Kemp just got out not even a month ago, and still he didn't get an ID. But there was a bunch of money just given to the Department of Correction for that for that purpose, to strengthen that they come home with mass IDs or renewal driver license and all that sort. So it's making the case that, much as what I've been saying the entire time, that black and brown folks, even though they're supposed to have access to these programs, they don't have access to them, not even at the medium facilities. And when they fight for those access, they're labeled as agitators, aggravators, and then put in the hole unnecessarily, and then what type of message does that send?
There's retribution.
Matt can talk about that.
Yeah,
I his own personal story, but
yeah, I mean, what's your experience with that?
Well, I mean, I am someone that did a lot of avocation when I was in, and so, for me, and that's why I always raised the question, what message does that send? If you give me a set of policies and practices and you say, hey, when you got a gripe, this is the way that you deal with it as part of a society. You got to keep in mind, even though prison is abnormal, it's supposed to be, or in many respects it is, a microcosm of what happens in the world at large. So if you're treating people in this way and you're teaching them that the rules and regulations don't apply, well, then that translates over when they get into the world, that those rules and regulations out here are arbitrary too. It's left to who's in power. And that's the wrong message if we're talking about the type of society that we're trying to build that's based on laws and justice.
You mentioned some of the funding. I think in your reporting you said that $780 million in the state budget just for prisons. Some of the advocates that you spoke with, what do they think? They obviously think that money could be better spent elsewhere. What kind of programs would they like to see that spent on?
Well, I mean, when you look at the budget of the DOC, it continues to go up, except despite the fact that the population of the prisons has really dropped by half over the last 10 years. And there's just such a small percentage of the money that goes towards reentry programs, education. And so a lot of folks say, the money really, there needs to be better amounts of money given to folks to help them reintegrate into society, to help educate them when they're there. And I also just wanted to say that when I started doing this project, I said to Mac, where are these folks who are being released directly from maximum security to the street? And basically he said, en masse and casse, drugged out and high. He knows personally people who died by overdoses, or there was a recent case of a guy who is back in prison after killing a police officer in Rochester, New York. So the stories are really, they affect the public as well as the human beings who are being released.
Oh, they're committing suicide. Mm-hmm. We just had someone that just killed himself recently. A friend that I know by the name of Reese just killed himself, but having undergone these types of experiences in prison and not being able to treat these illnesses on their way out, this is what happens. They're forced to come out here and act like they're normal. To act like what it is to be the standard of normal.
As if they were given
Absolutely.
a chance.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I wanted to play this clip from one of your interviews with Jamal, where he just talked about kind of that jarring experience.
I never had a chance. I never been to a medium. You think that an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old should be in a maximum security prison with grown men?
No.
No. Think about that. You know what I'm saying? That your son's 19 years old, he makes a mistake. I didn't kill nobody.
I mean, this is like that. His case, you're saying, is extremely. This is not an outlier.
He
right?
did say, yeah, the lot of he was yes, the fact that he was released, and he was released from what's it called, the secure SAU, which is actually even a more secure prison in the maximum security prison, where he was only allowed out to be put in a cage to walk around, or actually shackled to a table before he was released to the street. But he said the biggest issue was his classification from the very beginning, where he was put in maximum security prison.
Yeah.
Which he shouldn't have been. But this is why, as part of the Racial Equity and Correction Initiative, we're trying to get this data bill collected, because we know what's happening, but we need the data to support, to show that who's getting access and who's not getting access, right? And then we needed an oversight to actually get passed with that bill as an enforcement mechanism, because the Department of Correction had already said that they can't police themselves. And they continue to say that by the way that they use the subjective views in doing things, in determining people's classifications. The classifications is based on objectiveness, meaning that it's set and designed to base and deal with people as they are, transforming themselves in the moment in time. But what the department does is it holds on to anything and everything that you ever done Never mind, Jamal came back on the second sentence. He wasn't even on the previous sentence, and he got sent to the max because of that first sentence, which doesn't make no sense.
So they knew he had 2.5 years, and they put him in the max where he really didn't have the opportunity to figure out how to make it out when he got out.
You mentioned the study that the DOC is kind of doing on themselves. Is there any legislation? Is there any other, I mean, obviously there's legal advocacy from smaller groups, but is there more of a push maybe from lawmakers or anything to make any kind of change in this area?
Well, I just spoke about the bill that's pending.
Yeah.
And in the public safety and also in the judiciary. And I think we already had at least a hearing in the judiciary. We have an upcoming hearing in public safety right now that's coming up. And we would urge everyone to reach out to their state legislators and to ask them, get that bill out of committee and put it up for a vote. You know, we need this type of information. And this came out of the Structural Racism Commission as a recommendation that they couldn't even do their jobs because there wasn't enough data to support what they've already been hearing from anecdotal.
Need to get the data.
So,
okay.
right.
Jenifer McKim, Mac Hudson, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks,
Thank
Tori,
you.
for having
Thank you.
us.
It's my pleasure.